Welcome everyone to our panel discussing how to build belonging in the workplace. My name is Jennifer Liu and I report on the workplace for CNBC Make It. I'm joined by three guests today and they're going to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is LaFawn Davis. I'm Group Vice President of Environmental, Social, and Governance at Indeed. What that means really quickly is that I have environmental sustainability, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, social impact, AI ethics, and then a governance piece. Thank you for having me today.
And I'm Dr. Mara Ackerman. I'm a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the NYU Langone Health Medical Center, and I am the director for the Consultation Liaison Psychiatry Service. And in that setting, I help to manage hospitalized patients on medical and surgical services who have psychiatric comorbidities. I've also been very involved in our medical center in terms of serving our medical center staff's needs in terms of mental health throughout the pandemic.
Hello, I'm Melissa Thomas Hunt. I'm the Global Head of Diversity and Belonging at Airbnb, a member of the executive team, and a former academic, recovering business school professor.
Thank you everyone for being here. As many workplaces moved from in-person to virtual last year, employers were faced with new challenges in connecting teams and fostering a sense of belonging. Combined with compounded crises of the pandemic, the economic fallout, and the fight for social justice, employers today must now provide new resources and support to their teams. I'd like to start off with a question to offer the group a moment of reflection over the past year. March 2021 marks the one-year anniversary the coronavirus outbreak became a global pandemic, and a year since many office professionals were sent to work from home. So I'd like to look back and think, what do you believe your organization did well to support employees in this transition to not only working from home, but working from home during a pandemic? And on the flip side, what's one thing you wish your organization had done better from the start? LaFawn, let's start with you.
Well, often I will say I don't want to look back at last year, but we have 10,000 employees in 16 countries, and all of those employees work hard to bring our culture to life, live and breathe our values every day. And so, having to go to work from home around this time last year was a little jarring, but I think we have these strategic pillars when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and belonging that we've tried to exude throughout going to work from home. The decision was made pretty quickly in March, the beginning of March, that all 10,000 employees would work from home. And so we tried to anchor to these pillars. Those pillars are removing bias and barriers. So thinking about our workforce and reflecting the diversity that we have and building community around that. Building inclusive teams and products. So this is around making sure that our managers actually engage with their employees. It was all kind of shocking to work from home. And I think some of us were, including me, were in denial for a little bit about how long that would endure. So how do we make sure that our job seekers can continue to look for work on using our products? And how do we make sure that our managers engage with their teams? To ensure that we still have the culture that we want to create. And then lastly, cultivating a sense of belonging was a big one for us last year because you have to engage people differently. So, all the Slack channels were set up. We have inclusion resource groups, different communities. People are having, get-togethers and trying to engage much differently than we had before. I think us all being in these little boxes as we work from home, created a space where we got to know each other better. You see, dogs and cats in the background, you see parents, you see children. And so creating that sense of belonging actually took on a different turn as we work from home. So it's really about creating a space where everyone can thrive and bring their best self to work, even in the middle of a global pandemic. I think you asked a second question about what I wish we would have done differently. I think actually we did everything really, really well. I was very proud of the company. I was proud of our leadership and pivoting quickly. I think for me, it was just understanding that this was going to be a long time. I think we all thought, okay, we'll work from home. It'll be a couple of months and then we'll get back into the office. But that's not what happened. So kind of reality setting in and us continuing to pivot along the way was something I think we did well, but I think just maybe having a longer plan for us being in a work from home environment for a year.
And Melissa, same question to you. As you're helping support your colleagues, employees to transitioning to working from home, what objectives do you think your organization did well, and anything that you would, do a little bit differently?
Yeah, there's some additional complexities. So, Airbnb is a tech company in the travel industry. And so it's not only that we found ourselves in the pandemic, we found ourselves in the pandemic at a point where no one could really travel, at least back in March. And so there were a number of issues that we were wrestling with as we were trying to help employees acclimate to working from home, not being in the office. Our company's mission is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And, prior to going to work from home, as I had traveled around the globe to our different offices, there was always an energy. People came to work, certainly to do their work, but because they had best friends at work, there was a hum in the air. And so now you've taken away that hum, that energy, and you've also created a situation that was a major inflection point for the company as a whole. And so the first thing that we were doing was trying to figure out about the viability of the company. And we were also trying to figure out, and much to the way LaFawn said, we thought it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And so we were trying to figure out what were the short-term measures that we could take to keep people connected, ways that we were encouraging managers to reach out, to have quick conversations, to start, meetings, by actually checking in on people, by giving permission for people to show up fully with their pets, their elders, their children, all of those things. But we also have to realize that all of this then was, what came on the heels was the murder of George Floyd. And so that created another context and another level of stress. And so we ultimately ended up creating more opportunities for PTO, for emergency time off, adding additional wellness programs, and being really explicit from the CEO down, giving counsel to managers that you really had to check in on your employees to find out what types of flexibility did they actually need, how did they need to change their work schedules. But all of that, I wish we had done it sooner, but the reality was we just didn't know where we actually were. And so it would have been hard to even move faster, even with hindsight.
Yeah. Mara, I actually have a bit of a different question along those lines for you, because your workplace situation is a bit different, that you work with frontline healthcare workers. And I've read from you that in the past year, as you've worked with your colleagues, you found yourself repeating the same advice over and over. That similar to as you would on an airplane, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first. Why do you think it's so hard for people to remember that, to the point where you have to gently remind them? And how can people get better at that?
Thanks for that question. So, working in healthcare during this pandemic, of course, is completely unprecedented. And we, in our environment, there was really this divide between folks who never worked from home, who never stopped going to work. And not only never stopped going to work, but were working longer hours and under more strenuous conditions than they'd ever even thought was possible. Where in the beginning of the pandemic, they thought that, their lives were really at stake, and they feared that they would bring home illness to their families. And my task during that time is I was actually leading our work group on employee and staff wellness. And it was a daunting task because, again, people were really terrified and worried about basics like PPE, which we did have. But again, felt like it could become at any moment a scarce resource. And so I think it was very difficult to think about putting yourself first, because as a healthcare provider, you take your oath to take care of others. And I think the ethical principle is that you put your patients first. And at the same time, you never signed up to go to war and feel like putting your patients first could actually mean sacrificing yourself or your family. And so my role as a psychiatrist was really validating some of those experiences and trying to help our staff and my patients cope with what it was like to continue to go to work. And at the same time, many of us, myself included, had transitioned, fortunately, to work from home. So as a psychiatrist, our faculty practice at NYU has been using telemedicine for a number of years. And we were very lucky that we could quickly pivot to expanding our telemedicine platform. And so our psychiatrists and psychologists on the outpatient side could work remotely and see our patients effectively. And actually, we saw increased volumes and continue to in the outpatient mental health sphere because of the stresses of the pandemic. So we were busier than ever and continue to be. And so I think that there has been and continues to be a real sense of mission of, like, as a healthcare provider, we have to jump in. This is where we're needed. And so it gets really difficult to take a pause and to realize that we're at risk for burning out. We're at risk for our own mental health taking a toll and becoming depressed, becoming terribly anxious, not sleeping. And so, it's a really difficult balance of how do you make sure to do your duty, do your service to the community, but also take care of yourself. And I think one of the things we struggled with as an institution was limit setting, right? There's no such thing as coming into the office and then leaving at a certain time and separating and having those boundaries between when you're at work and when you're at home. And I think that cuts across sectors. But in healthcare, you could just work endlessly, like in so many other jobs. And so I think many of my colleagues didn't take vacations, because what did a vacation mean? As Melissa pointed out, right? Travel was shut down. So you could just continue to work endlessly. And so I think again, there has been a high degree of provider burnout for a number of different factors related to the pandemic. I think the vaccine has definitely offered hope, and healthcare providers being supported and valued within their communities has also invigorated the community, but there's been a tremendous toll on healthcare providers.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the issue of burnout. Study upon study shows how the pandemic has really fueled, chronic stress and burnout, and of course that impacts employees and how they bring themselves to the workplace. So Mara, as a healthcare professional, what do you think employers can be doing to better support the mental health and well-being among their workforce?
So I think it's really, really important to have access to mental health services for healthcare providers, and that may seem very basic, and yet it's very evident that across systems of care, access to mental health care is so variable and even more limited than maybe access to healthcare generally, which we already know is problematic. But right, the insurance benefits for mental health care are by and large much more limited than they are for other types of healthcare. And this is a problem throughout our entire healthcare system in the United States and in other parts of the world, but a huge problem that we face here. And so I think one thing that we do well at NYU is that our employees have really excellent benefits that allow them access to our Department of Psychiatry and our providers. And so we can take care of our own. And I do think we provide a really excellent level of care. Of course, I'm biased in some way. I ran our faculty group practice for a number of years. But I think that's been huge, and that our employees can see psychiatrists and psychologists at reasonable fees, where they don't feel like, they're gonna run through their savings in order to get mental health care. That's critical, because or else people can't do it, and it's impossible. And then getting mental health care just becomes another stressor. So we've actually, in our practice, expanded who we serve, and we've partnered with a number of different corporations actually in order to help their employees gain access to the same mental health care that our employees access. So we have a number of different corporate arrangements to do that. And I think that's, again, in the service of the best way to help employees not burn out and continue to be engaged in work and enjoy what they do and take care of themselves, is to provide readily available access that's what's covered within whatever benefits your company is supplying to your employees.
Certainly, and expanded access to healthcare and teletherapy options have certainly been big benefits and perks that employers have provided during this time. LaFawn, I'd like to kick it over to you to hear, in the past year, what other resources and forms of support have you found to be the most helpful among your colleagues, and any surprises?
Uh, no surprises, but I think pride. I'm really proud as people have come together, and empathy has been, I think, the benefit that's come out of the global pandemic and economic crisis and all of the things that happened in 2020, civil unrest and murder hornets and all the things. And I think some of the resources that helped with that sense of belonging in the workplace was absolutely the mental health resources, the virtual mental health resources. We also have an IRG called Access Indeed, which is about accessibility, and mental health was a topic of discussion there. We did manager guides. So specifically when there was civil unrest, we did manager guides, how to talk to your Black employees, right? Here's what to say. Here's how to start a conversation if they want to have one. Here's, if they don't want to talk about it, here are the things that you can do to create a space of psychological safety and belonging. Here are books to read, podcasts to listen to, documentaries to watch, people to follow on social. Because the reality is that a lot of managers just didn't know what to do. And the worst thing that you can do is act like everything is business as usual. We all went through some level of trauma last year. And so increasing ways that people can engage respectfully while building empathy, I think, was phenomenal. And that even translated to our external work. So, doing things through our social impact work with our job seekers to make sure that those that were most marginalized actually had a chance, and that we were able to help them break through barriers to employment. And that so translated kind of on both sides of the fence, because our employees built more empathy with each other, and therefore also built more empathy with our job seekers and with our employers. So I think the resources that we created in order to create that empathy was really, really helpful, around kind of just from everything from quick lists, here are the 5 things you can do, all the way through those full guides that actually help you understand more.
Yeah, and Melissa, over to you about, what resources and employee support that you found to be really impactful at your organization.
So there are certainly things that we did from an organizational level in terms of supporting employees directly. I think that one of the most important things that we did was, as a company with belonging at its center, we tried to figure out how we could leverage our platform to be helpful in the pandemic. And so we came up with the opportunity to host frontline stays and open the platform. And many of our hosts around the globe open their homes to allow medical professionals and other first responders to be able to stay at reduced or often for no cost at all. And I think why this was important at a time when so many of our employees were feeling helpless, knowing that the company that they worked for and some of the efforts that they were putting forth were allowing for a contribution to helping to save lives. In terms of like the specific programs that we put forth, we increase the access to mental health providers. In particular, we brought in trauma-informed counselors specifically to assist our individuals who are in our employee resource groups. We have 19 of those, and many of our Black and Brown individuals are participants in those, other individuals with more marginalized identities. So in addition to the pandemic, and the civic and racial tension and the murder hornets, there was another layer of stress. And so we felt it was important to create a safe space conversations. Many of our employee resource groups actually decided that they wanted to truly demonstrate allyship and created allyship guides. Our Black at organization created an allyship guide that was leveraged by many managers. Our learning and development team created many assets around how managers could support employees. I think I mentioned before that we increased time off, as well as access to different types of care for elders as well as for children. And so we were really trying to find ways to make our employees feel that we cared, that they were supported, and to find micro ways to increase a sense of belonging in a time when many were feeling quite isolated and others were feeling quite overwhelmed by the ways in which they had to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the concept of psychological safety, being able to establish that and build on that has been crucial for employers in this remote setting, especially. Mara, can you speak more to how organizational leaders should be thinking about how they build that and continue building that with employees?
I think it's a challenging question, when I think about our institution, because there are people across so many different job types in a medical center setting that I think it must vary so much. And I have to say, I don't have the experience of being someone in like human resources to think about that whole big picture and how it works together, but I can sort of give you a sense from within our department. I think, and I, as leading a team of providers, I think from that perspective, having regular meeting points where you left a space open to talk about provider experience. I think so. We have, for example, what we call peer supervision meetings, where we often took that space to talk about patient care and complicated cases and helped each other to manage that. And that space really turned into, how did we support each other? What was it like to be on the receiving side of such difficult, stressful information, and across all of our patients, right? It wasn't just that one patient was struggling. It was that everyone was enduring the pandemic, including us. And how are we managing those stressors? And I think that we just needed to create these spaces to continue to feel connected to one another and to not feel like we were trying to navigate this alone, despite working from home and despite absorbing so much of the difficult stressors from the pandemic, from racial unrest, from the sense that we couldn't sort of all be together in a room to feel that sense of connection and support. And so those meetings, I think, became essential. And we in our group, we met on at least a weekly basis, if not had a touch point much more regularly than that. And I think that really enhanced a sense of, we still had a community, we still had a place to belong, we weren't out there on our own. And we could have honest conversations about the fact that while we were still providing healthcare to others, we ourselves were drowning at times. And we needed an outlet and we needed a place to go to explore that. And that needed to be okay, to even have weak moments, to have moments where we were going to break down, where we might be brought to tears, and that was being human, that was expected for the situation. And I think we were largely able to do that. I mean, we also created on the ground what we called psychological first aid, so our psychiatry consultation service, which we also have a group of nurses that very much helped us on the ground during the height of the pandemic. And they were there to sort of interface and help with patients who were behaviorally struggling or having agitation or confusion. But in addition to that, they helped our frontline providers, so our nurses and our physicians and our respiratory therapists and our housekeeping staff and people who were on the ground in the room with COVID patients. They were providing what we call psychological first aid on the ground and helping in the moment, even with small tidbits, 2-5 minutes, to help sort of validate the fact that the provider experience was challenging and that there were things that they could do for themselves, even within a few minutes, to feel grounded and to feel like they could take a deep breath themselves. And I think that was critical.
No, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that I'm in the company of women who are in positions of leadership with their organizations. And women have made strides in the workforce representation over many decades of work. But the pandemic has disproportionately hit working moms forced out due to childcare and caregiving responsibilities. Moms of color are especially likely to be forced out of work. I'd like to hear from Melissa. Let's start with you. What you believe employers can do better to support working moms.
Oh goodness, this is truly a journey. I've been in conversations, many over the last week, and certainly over the many months that we've been in the pandemic, to understand how we can actually do better to support working parents, but more specifically working moms. We have to recognize that we are now there are individuals who very much pride themselves on being able to be excellent parents, providing safe, educational, stimulating environments for their children, and at the same time fully engage in work. And for those who have the opportunity, and for us at Airbnb, most of our workforce has had the opportunity to work remotely. Some of the benefits of that are also juxtaposed with the fact that we are now working with the entirety of our family in many cases. And how do we move forward? And I'm a mother of three. My children happen to be older, but I remember what it was like when they were young and when they were sick and when I had competing priorities between work and their care. And so we've tried to bring that to the forefront. We have one of our 19 employee resource groups is called Parents At, and they are incredibly vocal in advocating for seeing and making more visible the challenges of working parents. And so we have a new global head of benefits. And she's going to be working very closely informing, what does best practice look like? How can we provide better support? How can we truly communicate to managers that they need to be in conversation with their parents to understand more about the circumstances, to invite other participants into our Zoom calls, to recognize that there really needs to be flexibility, that it's not necessarily about, FaceTime and being seen, but it's really about allowing people the opportunity to deliver their best work when they're best able to deliver that work. And so it has to be a constant cadence because we're moving very fast. And it's very easy for managers to lose sight of it. So we have to make sure that at all levels, from the top down, that's being reinforced, that our parents and our working mothers in particular are incredibly talented group of individuals, that we're better as a company having them in the workplace. And so we need to seek opportunities to think about how we can create a better context for them to be successful.
Yeah, certainly. LaFawn, do you have anything in addition about how you view employers' responsibility in supporting working parents, caregivers, and mothers?
Absolutely. So plus 1,000 to everything Melissa said. But it also goes into kind of the flexibility that she was talking about. We created different working schedules. So you can either take some time off, like have a leave, do an 80% for 80%, alter your schedule in a different way. We wanted to make sure that our managers were giving that flexibility. And we have a resource group as well that's dedicated, but it's for parents and caregivers because we wanted to normalize the caregiving aspect as well. There are lots of people that had to care for people that were sick this year, whether it was COVID or otherwise, and other family members. And we wanted to make sure that we were normalizing men as well, because that actually makes it better for women in the workforce. It's not just, that women need to take time away. There are fathers also. There are other caregivers as well. So we created spaces where people could, again, create more empathy, allyship, storytelling. So we have what's called brave spaces, and that is creating empathy through storytelling. And then we also have what we're called healing spaces. And that's actually talking about the trauma that we've all been through, but particularly parents and caregivers having to juggle all the responsibilities at home. No matter what they had to do, whether it was a special schedule or whether they needed to, take time off in the middle of the day to help with some distance learning or other caregiving activities. I think continuing to survey and the Inclusion Resource Group has been phenomenal in bubbling up the needs of our parents and caregivers. So it's providing a voice, a space, providing different working schedules and flexibility, providing new benefits that you maybe didn't think about before, and normalizing all of that. These aren't this special circumstance in the year that we had, but how you have to be a caregiver in the workplace should be normalized anyway. And again, the inside translates to the outside. So even more of an effort to get our job seekers who have been impacted the most, right? Women have been impacted, and women of color even more so. You add the layer of being a parent or a caregiver on top of that, and that's just more and more barriers to find employment. So I think the more that we normalize the fact that working mothers, mothers of color, have an extra set of responsibilities and barriers, and we make that something that we talk about and create empathy about, then we're able to introduce new programs and services in a way that we hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, certainly. And on the topic of diversity and inclusion, I thought it was interesting that diversity job openings from March to June fell at about twice the rate as job openings overall. However, these openings did quickly rebound following the racial justice movement in response to the killing of George Floyd. According to Indeed, postings in D&I roles have risen 56% between September 2019 and September 2020. So, LaFawn, what do you make of this fluctuation in D&I openings and what they reflect about employer priorities?
Sure. So I think the roles dropped because D&I happens to be a space that can often get cut when a company does not view it as an actual priority. So when you're looking at all the things and ways that you have to save money because you're not sure how revenue is going to be, D&I is often the place that gets cut. So not only did the job openings drop, but there were quite a few individuals who did not have jobs in that space anymore. Then we had the awakening and the civil unrest after George Floyd and many, many, many others that have lost their lives to police brutality. And we saw a global movement. It wasn't just a few states here and there who were protesting. We saw the U.S. really kind of wake up with protests. We've seen it happen across other countries in the world. And so what happened was potential job seekers, employees, and others were calling companies out. What are you doing in this space? Not just the statement of solidarity, not just saying that you believe in diversity and inclusion. People wanted to see action, not just intent, but action. And so what you saw was companies come out of the space of being performative and going more into the space of taking action, which means you have to hire someone to actually move the needle within your organization. Organic diversity hasn't worked. So you can't just rely on it occurring because you have well-meaning people within the organization. You have to have initiatives, programs in place to actually change behavior. And we didn't get to this spot overnight, so it's going to take time to make change. So I think what we saw were companies who, one, were called out for not doing enough in this space, and two, for leaders that woke up to the fact that there actually needs to be more action. And allyship came up in droves. I think our Black inclusion group tripled in size. And that's because more allies were joining. What can we do? I didn't know it was this bad. Some people are like, oh my goodness, I'm racist. So, companies really are making, I hope, more of a concerted effort to take action in this space and really do the things that drive change, not just put up something on their website, not just say the words, but actually put the things in place that make a difference.
Yeah, well said. Melissa, I'd like to hear from you. Given the expanding demand in the D&I field, what do you think employers should be keeping in mind as they hire for these roles and support these roles ongoing?
It's a great question. So, LaFont says that, corporations, organizations move from being performative to being more substantive. And I think that's true. I hope that we're able to sustain that moment. I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical about that. As organizations are thinking about how do they actually do this, they really need to be thinking about the long term. They need to think about how do we actually invite people into the organization to do this work? How do we give them the resources that they need to do it? This is very relational work. As managers and leaders are really struggling because it's outside of their lived experience to know what to say and do. It means that you actually have to have people to walk hand in hand, to lock arms with them, to tell them that it's a safe space, to coach them. And so that takes a truly a financial commitment. It takes a commitment of other professionals. One person in a company can't do it alone. It really takes a team in order to do it. One, because the individuals also need social support. It's hard work. And so organizations need to be thinking about the long term. What are they actually building? How are they going to actually create impact? What are all the places in which they need to infuse their policies and their practices with greater awareness of creating belonging inclusion for a diverse array of individuals. How are they going to invite people into the company? How are they going to support their recruiting team? And so it can't just be a check the box. It can't just be a parade of people who come through. It has to be through having top line goals, but also providing the resources to execute and to support moving forward and operationalize and delivering on those goals. I feel very fortunate, given the tough time that the company had, where we had to reshape the business and where we actually had to engage in a RIF. One of our primary principles that we will do it with an eye to diversity wherever we can. And so we actually came out of that very challenging period, launching our diversity and belonging strategy, refreshing our diversity dashboard, making a commitment to having 20% people of color in aggregate on our executive team and on our board of directors. And then ultimately, before closing out 2020, making a commitment that we would have 20% underrepresented minorities in the US and 50% women in the gender binary at the company by the end of 2025. And it's not enough for us to just declare those top line goals. We have to have a suite of programs that we put in place. It's hard work. It takes sustained effort and commitment at all levels.
Yeah. I'd also like to get a sense of how your organizations have been hiring in the past year, and how you've had to change your approach to recruiting, hiring, and onboarding new employees, especially while working remotely. Melissa, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. We have a very elaborate onboarding process called check-in, and we immediately pivoted it to being online. But the reality was that because of the nature of the way our business was affected, we virtually had to pause our recruiting practices. But now that they are back in line, what we found is that, especially with the diversity goals that we have set, we have to be really thoughtful and deliberate. So one of the things that we've done is we've created a mandate that every single candidate that we consider will be asked diversity and belonging questions, because we want to signal that this is a core value. And we also want to be able to have a sense of, when people come into the organization, to what extent do they need additional coaching and support moving forward. In our tech ranks, we have reimagined what the technical assessment process can really look like, so that we make sure we're measuring people based upon the jobs that we're asking them to do. And so there are a whole host of things that, now that we have reopened our recruiting, that we are doing, on top of which we've just announced that we are going to have Atlanta as a tech hub. And we made that determination because we realized that we wanted to get to the broadest array of talent, and we wanted to have a technical presence on the East Coast. And we know that there's wonderful, demographically diverse, talented candidates that are located. So it has to be a multifaceted approach to recruiting, both in changing our processes, which remain our check-in processes, which remain online, but also in reaching to a broader array of individuals, as we're now in this more remote environment.
Yeah, a follow-up on that, Melissa. Can you give us an example or two of the types of, questions regarding to a candidate's commitment to diversity and inclusion, and what those questions really mean, what you're looking for?
So I'm not going to get the specifics right, but I can give you the general essence of a couple of them. So, one question might be, can you give an example of the ways in which you have demonstrated your commitment to advancing diversity, inclusion, and belonging? In what ways have there been opportunities where you've observed individuals who have not created belonging, and how did you address that? In hindsight, after reflection, what might you do differently to move forward? So those give a sense of it. The important thing about these questions is they're questions that we believe that anyone could have the capacity to answer. And it's perfectly reasonable that someone might say, you know what, in the firms or the companies where I've worked before, diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity haven't been first and foremost, but I am really committed to that, and I am drawn in, and I want to learn more, and I want to do more. That becomes a perfectly acceptable answer.
LaFawn, how about yourself? How have you seen Indeed change its approach to recruiting, hiring, and onboarding in the past year?
So we are a hiring company. So a lot of what we're doing has the effect both internally and externally. So I think one of the most obvious pivots this last year and into this year is moving from traditional hiring practices into virtual models. And I think even after the pandemic is over, which I hope happens soon, I think companies are still going to do virtual hiring. I think for us, we slowed down a little bit to see how the year was going to work out. So we still hired, but just not massively. But that gave us a chance to look at the programs that we had, look at how we were hiring, set things in place so that this year, when hiring resumes more, which it has, that we have certain things in place that we didn't before. I think externally, the video platform on Indeed has really changed the space when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, because it allows an employer to set kind of objective skill-based requirements. And any candidate that matches those requirements gets automatically scheduled for an interview. There's much less chance for bias to creep in because you're not looking at the person. You're not, well, what school did they go to? And do they work at companies that I like? It's not about any of that. They have shown that they have the skill set. They get automatic interview with you. And so what we're seeing is a bigger increase in inclusion of marginalized communities, because that unconscious bias or conscious bias doesn't have a chance to creep in, at least before the interview stage. So many more people passing through the process for companies. We don't eat dog food, because I don't know why we would do that, but we do drink our own champagne. And so a lot of the things that we test out internally for our own practices, we also use to help job seekers as well. So I think some of these practices in play where we're trying to remove bias out of the process, we're trying to remove barriers to entry. So things like, do you really need a college degree for this role? And if not, that shouldn't be actual requirement. What are the true skill sets for these roles? What other barriers could we actually break in-house so that we can help our clients, our employers do the same? So it really is just like two sides of the same coin of the way that we hire and the way that we're trying to help all of our employers do that as well.
Yeah. And prior to the pandemic, the majority of job interviews happened on site, which could give the interviewee insight into the company's culture, what their future colleagues are like. Mara, this might be a good question for you. What do you think job seekers should be paying attention to gauge a company's culture, and especially their commitment to fostering a sense of belonging in a remote environment?
So thanks for the question. I think that in terms of starting in a remote job or interviewing remotely, it's really critical that employers really allow you to meet probably more folks that are going to be a part of your team or part of your organization, because you're not getting that sense of what it's like to be there, to walk around the place that you're going to work, to get a sense of the overall culture. And that the best way to get a sense of diversity, inclusion, and belonging is to know who else is going to work there. Who are your colleagues? What are their attitudes like? How do they make you feel when you interface with them, even over a Zoom call? And so I think that really expanding that panel and being open to the fact that maybe this process is going to take longer, right? You're not going to have a single interview day where that person is going to get a sense that they're going to belong, they're going to fit in. You're going to need to really be flexible and have a sense to zone in on who might they be interested in, who might they link with, and try to get them that sense of what it's like to be there and be on that team. And so I think that we've really tried to be flexible when talking to new candidates and let them get a sense of, who is part of that team and how do we continue to promote a sense of belonging and community even while continuing to work remotely.
Certainly. Many proponents of flexible work say hiring remote employees can help employers diversify their workforces. What DEI considerations and standards do you think need to be in place to support these remote workers in those situations? Melissa, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, in many respects, having the best DEI standards in place then becomes a platform from which you can leverage remote. So the value of remote is that you can go much broader in reaching, a demographically diverse array of top talent. You're not limited to one geographic geographical location. And to the extent that we actually need the best talent, we want to open the aperture, and we want to be able to do that. The types of things that need to be in place, ideally we want to have some standards around having diverse candidate slates that have been articulated, which means that many companies have said that at the point that we bring people in for the first interview, it used to be the on-site, and now it's Zoom, but it's still the first major interview. That there needs to be a particular configuration array, so that because we know from the research that the configuration of that slate of candidates actually affects the outcomes. We know that has implications for underrepresented minorities. It has implications for women, particularly in the tech. So we need to make sure that our foundations are really clear. I loved what LaFont said about having really clear criteria. We need to have clear criteria that are in place, that we measure every candidate against that criteria, so that we allow ourselves to mitigate as much bias as possible. The remote environment always makes things a little bit more complicated, because you don't have it can be harder to establish rapport for individuals potentially who come from groups that have not historically been represented at the organization. They don't necessarily get that warm-up time to establish rapport face-to-face with an individual that allows them to relax and really show up as their best selves. They show up immediately on camera. And so we need to be sensitive, and we need to make interviewers aware that they may have to go a little bit farther to establish that rapport, so that individuals who have not had access because they have people, friends and acquaintances who are working at the company, can learn to, can actually relax a bit, that they can be able to clearly articulate, think about questions, answer them in the ways that they would if they had a little bit more of that warm-up time. But having the opportunity to have people remotely is a huge unlock for diversifying our hiring outcomes.
Yeah, certainly. And in that same vein, LaFon, for remote employees, especially for those who may be of underrepresented minorities within their new employer, what can organizations do to ensure that these remote employees are supported throughout their careers and that they have opportunities to advance?
Yeah, so I think it all comes down to being intentional about creating a space of empathy, psychological safety, and belonging. And sometimes, I talked earlier about the fact that we all, some of us thought it would be a couple months that we would be working from home and we'd all be back into our offices. I was doing a good, 70% travel where I could actually go to the offices and meet with employees. But it hasn't worked out that way. We're here at almost the year mark, and it's going to continue for a little bit longer. So I know some managers had a tendency to kind of hold back some of the things they would have normally done to engage their teams. We had people start after we worked from home. After we had everybody work from home, we had employees who were hired. So they've never been in an office. They've never met their colleagues face to face and still can't. And so a company really has to think about the ways, and a manager really has to think about the ways to continue to engage their team and continue to build empathy with their team, even if everyone is remote and distributed. I think, we have 10,000 people in 16 countries. So a lot of our teams were distributed anyway. You might have, a percentage of people in one office and then some in several other offices, or some may have already been remote. And so that created spaces where people felt, potentially excluded in meetings where, they had to jump in, or maybe they weren't, thought of they weren't asked for their thoughts. And so now I think we have a chance to do a little bit of a reset, using best practices for remote employees as the cornerstone, because we're all remote employees now. So when we go back to whatever normal is, for us, we will have a small percentage of people in the office. Other people are mostly on flex time. Other people are going to be remote. So it's really going to be important that we continue to engage employees using remote engagement as the cornerstone for the entire workforce. And I honestly think it's going to be a little bit of work in progress. We're going to try some things and hopefully it works. If it doesn't, we'll stop and pivot and do something else. But the main part is that employees need to feel like their company is intentionally trying to engage them.
Yeah, certainly. And this next question is for everyone. LaFawn, let's go ahead and start with you on that thought. As workplaces look to reopen following the pandemic, there's certainly an appetite among office workers to be able to continue working from home. There may be a lot of situations where workforces are in a hybrid of on-site and remote workers. What do you think will be the biggest challenges employers will have to do in navigating that situation? And what do you think are the biggest opportunities?
So workforce transformation, which is I'm sure talked about a lot, is what companies have to figure out right now. I mentioned we'll have some in office, but that's probably a small percentage. Mostly flex. So that means you're in the office a few days a week and at home or somewhere else a few days a week. And then there's those that will be completely remote. And I don't think it's very clear how all of that's going to work out, right? There's going to be some office space that we don't need to use for that. So how do we pivot that office space and maybe use it for the community? How do we make sure that people continue to get onboarded no matter what space they're in, as far as in-office flex or remote? And I don't think that there is a silver bullet here. I don't think that there's some companies who are like, our entire workforce is going to be remote going forward, right? We've all been working from home for a year. Clearly it works and we're productive. But for some employees, working at home during a global pandemic is not working. They may not even have the best dedicated space. They may have 5 roommates. They may have children who are there. It's not always the best space. And then there's other employees where it is absolutely better that they're not commuting a couple hours a day, that they get that time to just work from home. So I think it's going to be an evolving process. And I would think, something to watch out for is if you're going into this space in a really rigid way, I think you're going to have to be flexible with re-engaging your workforce back into the office in some way and determining what makes sense for your company. Can you figure out ways to still engage the workforce if they're all remote, partially remote? And what are you going to do depending on role, not person? Because if it's dependent on the person, it's not as equitable. It should be, can the role work remote or in a flex environment? And if so, then that's the options that employees should have. So there's a lot that's still being figured out. I know companies are doing this in lots of different ways. We have set a structure in place for those 3 different categories. And I think it's now, until we actually go back into an office, it's between the teams and the leaders and the managers to work out what makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, how about yourself? I feel like Airbnb may have some business opportunities in a future of remote and hybrid work situations. But what do you think will be the biggest challenges to fostering belonging in hybrid or remote workforces in the future? And what do you think are the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, so the challenges are that people like to gather, right? They like to, there's an energy when you're actually in the physical presence of other individuals. And, at Airbnb, we particularly celebrated that. We were a company of gatherers, and people are missing that. Simultaneously, working remote works for many people. Like, there are additional benefits and ways that they can gather and be with people that they love, old acquaintances, and they're creating or reestablishing new communities. We have made the commitment that our base of employees can work remotely until the end of August 2021, and that we're in the process of really figuring out what is that going to look like? What are the roles that can be done remotely in a sustainable way? How are we going to structure our workplace? What we know is that our CEO has said that flexibility is going to be a part of that. And we really need to now understand, what does flexibility mean for the different stakeholders at the company. But you're absolutely right. The many companies' determination that their employee bases, at least in part, can work remotely, does have implications for our guests and our hosts on our platform.
Not to mention, Melissa, Airbnb has some gorgeous offices. So
we do.
Gather in them.
We do. We absolutely do. They are very pleasant spaces in which to be.
Mara, I'm curious.
I appreciate what Levon and Melissa both said in terms of flexibility. I think that yes, defining like what roles can be translated to work remotely, but then I think ultimately being able to have individual touch point with your workforce to figure out what's it been like for them to work from home. What is their experience? And to not make assumptions that it's either been positive or negative. What does it look like? Because I would say, and especially as a New Yorker, a proud New Yorker, working in New York City apartments is very different than what other people's experiences might be working in a house, right? And just that alone, what people's access is to a safe space. Do they have the ability to find a private workspace within their home? Because I think that's been such a strain for so many people across the world. But I would say, I think in New York City, it's common for so many of us, even those of us who have resources, to have limited spaces. And so, and to be working with children from home and trying to be a childcare provider. And for some parents, that means being at home allows them to see their children more, allows them to provide what they need in order to work effectively and parent effectively. And for others, trying to work out of their homes has made it nearly impossible because they can't find the separation. They can't feel that sense of belonging with their workplace, and it's a struggle. And so I think really being able to understand the individual narrative and what this pandemic has been like for them and what working from home is like for individuals is critically important as we try to inform practices and decisions about the larger workforce and about larger systems of work. And so, I think on a smaller team level, like for my even team of maybe 10, I've been so interested to hear that for some of them, they want to be on site. They want to be in their office, or they want to be at the hospital. That's what sort of makes them tick. That's what they enjoy. And for others, it's really the opposite, that if they could work remotely in an ongoing way, that would be so fulfilling for them. And that would make their lives work so much more seamlessly in terms of family life and work life. And so I think that that narrative is just crucial.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed our discussion about building belonging in the workplace in 2021 and beyond. Thanks so much to our panelists today, Lafon, Melissa, and Mara. Really enjoyed spending time with you. Thank you.